I want to begin by just saying two words, Donald Trump, to just get that out in the open. Is Donald Trump the linchpin of the problem of regulatory capture? No, absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying today. But as an American traveling abroad, I have been appreciative of the fact this week that no one has asked me about Donald Trump or to explain the political situation or the turmoil in the United States. And that has really been quite a relief, so thank you for that. But then on the other hand, I thought maybe I haven't been asked about the US and Donald Trump because you're preoccupied with other political turmoil. We have Brexit, we have the Catalonia secession, recent election results in Austria, Operation Car Wash, and the impeachment of the Brazilian president. And I could go on to talk about other types of political turmoil. Now, none of this is actually a joking matter. Of course, and I do have a point to make about it, and the point that I want to make is that, in my opinion, all of these events are interrelated, and they're all part of negative consequences of regulatory capture. Professor Doyle mentioned distrust in financial institutions after the global financial crisis. The point I want to emphasize is that the capture of financial regulators was really at the base of the global financial crisis and the EU crisis and the Great Recession, which followed on the heels of that financial crisis. These huge economic shocks contributed to the difficult political situations that we're facing today. Regulatory capture and its dramatically negative consequences this time around has affected not only the global economy, but the global political economy. So the current situation is clearly an extreme, an outlier. But even in less extreme circumstances, regulatory capture has negative consequences for the economy and for society. In distorting markets to create gains for one or more powerful segments of an industry, significant economic losses are dealt out to consumers in that industry and to other sectors of the economy. Innovation and growth in the industry are distorted. Over time, regulatory capture will undermine confidence in the industry and in the legitimacy of the regulating institution. And as we've seen in recent times, this might extend to legitimacy of the regulatory state and the government regime. So governments and regulated industries should take into account these lessons and be mindful of the importance to everyone of maintaining integrity and balance in the regulatory system. To be more precise, this is how I'm defining regulatory capture: as a situation in which regulatory decisions promote the interests of the regulated rather than societal interests or the general social welfare. And while the terminology is regulatory capture, it's important to recognize that capture can occur in the legislative arena, in the rulemaking arena, the supervision or enforcement arena as well. If private interests prevent the writing of bills or the passing of laws regarding an industry, this could be a form of regulatory capture. If a new civil code does not change the practices in an industry because supervisors or the courts don't enforce the law, this could be regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is often thought of as arising very directly from bribery or from its more tactful cousin, political contributions. But most modern scholars distinguish regulatory capture as moving beyond mere corruption of that form to something cultural and systemic in the regulatory system. Corruption is ultimately transactional in nature. The regulated gives payment to a decision maker in exchange for a favorable ruling. But true regulatory capture is not transactional, it's relational. It's a melding of the minds, or a common understanding of what the objectives of the industry and the regulatory body are, rather than something that's simply corruption or transactional in nature. Regulatory capture is not a new problem. I think it's receiving a lot more attention these days, but it's been recognized as an issue of concern for a long, long time, to political philosophers, to designers of political institutions. Economists have actually come pretty late into this study. The modern incarnation of regulatory capture studies in the area of economics dates from the work of economist and Nobel laureate George Stigler in 1971. But academic studies of regulatory capture in political science and public administration had already been written by the 1950s. Moreover, the threat of capture had been recognized in the US at least as early as the Federalist Papers, a series of political essays written in the 1700s by the original signers of our Constitution. Those authors, in turn, relied heavily on classical political theories from Socrates, Aristotle, Machiavelli, each of whom addressed the problem of regulatory capture in various guises. In terms of practical political responses to regulatory capture, the progressive reform area in the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century was largely rooted in the recognition that concentrated industry interests and powerful industrialists had captured the political institutions and diverted them to serve their ends. The progressives sought to reduce the influence of industries over government policy by reducing the decision authority of legislatures. Legislators were in the pocket of industry due to campaign contributions and kickbacks awarded for favorable policies. Unchecked monopolies and unfair competition abounded. Consumers had little information and even less recourse when producers provided shoddy quality or colluded to raise prices. So to address this bad state of affairs, the progressive reformers established independent regulatory commissions to regulate selected industries. So the notion of the regulatory commission is one that is a body that's independent from both the executive branch and the legislative branch, with a separate budget, separate rulemaking authority, led by multiple commissioners with protected term lengths and staggered appointment dates. This is an organizational structure specifically designed to thwart regulatory capture. Unfortunately, over time, industries realize that an independent regulatory commission may be a much easier target for regulatory capture than a legislature. Think about the differences. The regulatory commission has only a few members, has a focused interest squarely on the industry, has a technical understanding of the regulated industry. In contrast, legislatures are large, multi-focused, and generalist in nature. Individual legislators may be captured, but they're the only one of a part of a whole which has many interests beyond the regulated industry. Indeed, in hindsight, the Independent Regulatory Commission might be the perfect vehicle through which an industry may exert influence over regulatory policy. This last point is the insight that economist George Stigler brought to the analysis in 1971. Stigler's capture theory in economics suggested that industries seek to be regulated by government in order to promote an operating environment that's favorable to the large incumbent firms in the industry, using regulation to suppress competition, to prevent or reduce entry of new firms, and to protect market shares by stifling product innovation. Important recent work by contemporary political scientists such as David Moss and William Novak re-examines US regulatory history and raises serious doubts about the general validity of capture theory as Stigler constructed it. Nonetheless, the theory became an essential building block of an anti-regulatory philosophy of the so-called Chicago School of Economic Thought on regulation and its political economy, which concludes in one article, and I'm quoting now, "It may be preferable not to regulate and to suffer the bad effects, rather than to regulate and suffer the effects of political imperfections," end quote. I happen to think that that is completely wrong. This theory, this capture theory, which has many followers in various guises in economics and in politics, is overly narrow and gives what I think are harmful prescriptions for the economy. So here is where I think are two real failings of that theory. First, the capture theory fails to recognize that an industry may seek to achieve a variety of different outcomes through influencing regulators. For example, capture may be used to avoid or weaken regulations. That is, not regulating can itself be the result of a political imperfection. This seems to, in fact, be the more common objective of industries in modern times, maybe because omission of action by a regulator is easier to achieve, and because causes of inaction by a regulator may be easier to mask. But we can't solve the problem of lack of regulatory action if our solution to the regulatory capture is to deregulate. Another failing of this theory, which suggests that deregulation is the solution to regulatory capture, is, and I'm going to echo some of the sentiments of Professor Doyle here, its failure to recognize that there are important social benefits of regulating some industries. So some of the social responsibility or social objectives that Professor Doyle put forward for the insurance industry, as an economist, I recognize that those really cannot be achieved by an industry on its own. It can be achieved by a regulated industry if society wants to impose those duties on an industry. But to call for moral actions of those sorts on the part of an unregulated industry is not going to lead to a sustainable outcome. But in industries such as insurance, completely unfettered market competition can in fact hinder the market, irrespective of the moral responsibilities or the social duties that Professor Doyle is talking about. From an economic perspective, the intangible nature of financial products, which are essentially promises, right, contingent promises, lead to markets which rely heavily on trust and consumer confidence. And this is why Professor Doyle's mention of the statistics about the low level of consumer confidence and trust in the industry are in fact important. And again, not just from a societal perspective, but from an economic perspective. Because of complexity and uncertainty, it's not possible to contractually specify firm behavior in every possible state of the world. And this incompleteness then reduces demand for services and inhibits growth of the industry. So for an industry like insurance, like for other financial services, specific legal safeguards for customers are essential to promoting healthy insurance markets. And that's not a small point. Insurance markets are really important in both the macro and the microeconomic sense. At the microeconomic level, insurance facilitates risk-taking by both individuals and firms, which can help to promote economic growth, supporting individuals in making large purchases, encouraging innovation by firms and investment by firms, which generate risk. At the macroeconomic level, insurance premiums make up a significant percentage of gross domestic product in many advanced economies. And insurance market development, a healthy insurance market, has been shown to be related to overall economic development of a country and is a significant driver of economic growth. So where does that leave us? So on the one hand, we recognize that regulatory capture is serious and a significant problem. On the other hand, we are left with the conclusion that regulation is important and perhaps even necessary for an industry such as insurance. So where this leaves us is simply saying political imperfections in regulation mean we've got to have a perfectly competitive market, unfettered by legal and regulatory constraints, to a circumstance in which we say we need to think carefully about how we design regulatory institutions and regulatory processes to protect against capture. Recognizing that there are always going to be some failures in achieving this protection from regulatory capture. So to do this, we need first a nuanced and constantly evolving understanding of the various modes of regulatory capture and the factors which facilitate it. Just as bribery alone does not determine regulatory capture, capture doesn't depend on bribery. Capture may arise from many other less obvious influences, which include things like the cultural assimilation of regulators, the limited expertise of regulators, or the limited resources of regulators. So some examples from the slide here. Access, personal relationships. Who has the best access to regulators? The regulated firm or other stakeholders? Surely they're dealing mostly with regulated firms. This can lead over time or in subtle ways to the change in the regulatory relationship. Especially in industries in which technical knowledge is required, the industry can be a very valuable source of that technical knowledge for regulators. If we don't have highly professional regulators, how are they going to effectively regulate? They need to get their information from the industry, and that can, over time, change the nature of the regulatory relationship. We can also see regulators adopting certain cultural or ideological identities that are in line with the industry that they regulate. This is something that's commonly discussed in terms of the regulatory failings in the global sense that led to the financial crisis. There was a lot of identification between the regulators and the regulated. And partly this can be the product of something that's known as the revolving door. The revolving door is a circumstance in which, because of the need for technical knowledge and expertise, regulators may be chosen from important individuals in the industry to be regulated. In turn, as regulators develop relationships with the regulated industry and demonstrate their own skills and technical knowledge, when they leave the regulatory agency, they may go to work for industry, right? So the so-called revolving door also has important implications for relationships between regulators and the regulated. And the problem here is that through these forces, and this is why I'm saying regulatory capture, the true regulatory capture is relational, not transactional, not really based on the exchange of money, but on relationships. Because through these types of forces, we can come to a situation in which regulators take the perspective of an industry when regulating and believe in full good conscience that they are fulfilling their duties as regulators. So these influences are often difficult to directly observe and measure, and this is the real problem of regulatory capture. This is what makes it such a difficult problem to solve. In the face of this very persistent but sometimes subtle problem, what can we do? Are there things that we can do? There certainly is no one magic bullet, no quick fix, no single solution, but history and scholarship have shown that there are structural and process adjustments which can mitigate against regulatory capture at least some of the time. Right? And this is what we have to recognize, at least some of the time, and that's as good as it's going to get. Here are some ideas, some solutions that have worked in some circumstances, and things that should be thought about when one is thinking about designing regulatory institutions, including both structure and processes, to try to avoid regulatory capture. One is to think carefully about the mechanism for choosing regulators. In some circumstances, election of regulators has been shown to work, while in other circumstances, including insurance, it has been shown to not alleviate regulatory capture. But the process for choosing regulators should be multi-tiered, should not be simply one person in charge chooses regulators with no input from other stakeholders or no oversight. Broad representation needs to be sought, and that includes representation from consumers. One way to solve this problem that regulators mostly interact with the regulated industry is to include consumers on an advisory board. So many regulatory agencies are now required to have a consumer advisory board. And typically these boards are not average consumers. They're academics or leaders of NGOs, consumer advocacy groups, who can take the consumer perspective, but also have a broad understanding of the industry. The professional staff, the permanent staff, the bureaucracy can also be a good safeguard, especially if there are whistleblower protections in place. In the US, and I don't know to what extent this is true in other countries, there is oftentimes conflict between appointed leaders of agencies, whether they're regulators or cabinet members, and the permanent bureaucratic staff, when it seems that the leaders are straying away from the foundations of the agency or the department. And so there have been many studies of how this type of conflict within the Food and Drug Administration in the US has led to significant reforms at the FDA, with the caveat being in place that the FDA does offer whistleblower protections to empower the bureaucracy to come forward with objections and to raise red flags. On the process side, we do want regulators to have power, but we oftentimes want to think about ways to limit their discretion. So in insurance and banking, the notion of prompt corrective action is one such limit on regulators' discretion, where they're given specific metrics which they are required to use when deciding whether or not to take over a firm that's deemed to be in financial distress, to avoid this negotiation between the regulated firm and the regulator. Fraternization, old-fashioned word, but I think that's the best way to think about it, also needs to be limited. And many times we see this through limits on gift acceptance. And these limits can be quite strict, and if you think of them as limits on gift acceptance, you can think of them as really dumb. But I think the true point of them is to curb the ability of regulator and regulated to socially interact. Because where this tends to bind is in things like dinners, parties. So many regulators are restricted from accepting dinner that costs more than $25, for example. Or if going to dinner with a regulated client firm, the regulator must pay their own way, for example, right? It's not that they're going to be bought with those types of gifts or favors, but it does limit opportunities, or, you know, limit the fun of socially interacting between regulators and the regulated. Final really important thing is to ensure decision transparency. Many governments now are implementing transparency initiatives where everything that regulatory agencies decide on goes up on the internet. There definitely needs to be a notice and comment requirement when regulations are being considered. And I'll add something to that based on a conversation I had here, not just a notice and comment period, but a requirement that the regulator respond, usually on the internet or in a general document, respond to comments, to specifically say, we received comments that this is a problem, here's why we think it's not, or here's what action we're taking on it, rather than those comments coming in and just being tossed in the trash or put into a black hole. So these are some of the things to think about in terms of institutional design. But we have to recognize that even with these types of structures in place, these sorts of adjustments, they're not going to protect against regulatory capture indefinitely. What I always emphasize to my students is that regulation is a dynamic game. As soon as we introduce a new regulatory system or a new regulatory rule, that is going to introduce reactions. That's going to introduce reactions from firms in the regulated industry. It's going to introduce reactions from competitor firms, competitor industries, new industries maybe, it could even arise, and from consumers. So the act of establishing a regulatory system or a regulation in and of itself makes some other changes in the market. The market is not static. So for this reason, something that's really important is to periodically reevaluate the regulatory system, regulatory actions, to determine, is the regulatory system achieving the goals that have been set out for it? As was stated in one of the previous presentations or comments, someone said, who's supervising the supervisors? And that is a key question, because this is really important. Someone needs to be supervising the supervisors. And this doesn't literally mean we need to create, multiple layers to say, well, then who's supervising the supervisors of the supervisors, right? But it means to have some form of review that comes about in circumstances other than in the aftermath of a crisis or a scandal. So the way that this oftentimes works, in the U.S. federal government, we have executive branch review of agencies. Our Government Accountability Office is empowered. This is its specific role, is to do evaluations of agencies and whether they're operating effectively. In some cases, they do evaluations of specific regulations or programs of agencies to determine whether the process was appropriate in establishing that, and to determine the effects and whether those effects are in line with the stated objectives of the regulation or the program. Of course, we also have judicial review of regulations, and I know that's in place in most countries. And that's important. One problem with that is that can be very expensive and falls on the shoulders of private citizens, typically, to take up the burden of introducing or requesting a judicial review. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that the list of structural issues, process issues that I laid out can't just be viewed as a menu in which we can pick a few things out and say, well, if we have this structure, this restriction in place, we've solved the problem. All of these things need to work together to ensure that we have in place institutions that are well designed, that we have in place capable regulators. They actually do know what they're doing and that they understand the industry. And most importantly, a culture of regulatory professionalism, so that regulators believe that they are accomplishing something important by fulfilling their regulatory duties. It's not a small task, and it's always going to have to be revised over time, but something that's really very well worth producing. So thank you very much. Those are my comments, and truly, this is...